It was a rare sort of summer day in the village of Luffington Bales, warm but not oppressive, the sun tempered by a polite breeze, and the air faintly scented with honeysuckle. At the rectory garden, bunting fluttered lazily over trestle tables, adorned with Victoria sponge, jam tarts, and an ill-advised jelly shaped like the Queen's head. The annual church fete had arrived, and with it came all the familiar faces of the village, some welcome, some tolerated, all accounted for. Miss Jane Marple, spinster of St. Mary Mead and house-guest of her distant cousin the vicar's wife, had settled herself into a comfortable wicker chair just shy of the petunia bed. A cup of weak tea rested on her saucer, untouched but politely accepted. She sat beneath a parasol, knitted shawl over her shoulders despite the weather, her pale, blue eyes seemingly drowsy behind her spectacles. But her gaze wandered, ever alert, ever cataloguing. The fete bustled with precisely the sort of subtle tensions Miss Marple found most instructive. A sideways glance here, a forced laugh there, the slightly too loud protestation of innocence over a mist jam judging ribbon. Human nature in its most deliciously unguarded form. At the tombola table, Colonel Arbuthnot grumbled good-naturedly as he accepted a tin of marrow-fat peas. Just beyond him, the elegant widow, Mrs. Evangeline Carroway, held court beneath the rose arbour, dispensing smiles and gossip in equal measure. And near the croquet lawn, Arthur and Mildred Pendry, never quite a match, those two, stood awkwardly apart, as if joined by marriage, but divided by everything else. At precisely 3:23 p.m., as recorded later by Reverend Calthorpe's ever-punctual wife, a scream broke through the pleasant hum of village festivity. It came from the vicarage's side lawn, behind the hedge bordering the rose walk. Several heads turned, Miss Marple's included, though hers tilted just slightly, as if testing the timbre of the sound. It was sharp and female, more shock than terror, but not feigned. Moments later, a young maid named Edith, a new hire rather undertrained, came stumbling into view. Her cap was askew, and her face pale as the custard on the dessert table. "It's Mr. Denham, in the tool shed! Oh, it's awful! It's all black and smoking! He's... Oh!" Miss Marple rose without fuss, placing her cup gently on the tray. Around her, people began to stir and move, as if called to a play where no one quite knew their role. Within moments, the villagers had gathered outside the small wooden shed tucked near the orchard path. Smoke still wafted in a thin, acrid coil from the roof. The door hung ajar. Inside, slumped beside a scorched pile of gardening gloves and newspapers, lay the charred remains of a man. Though fire had taken much of the details, the form was unmistakably that of Mr. Lionel Denham, the wealthy, if somewhat resented, land agent from Luffington Hall. Someone gasped. Another began to pray, the air filled with whispers. "Must have been an accident," muttered Colonel Arbuthnot, already deciding. "Smoking in there, no doubt. Damn fool never listened." But Miss Marple's eyes were not on the body. She was looking instead at the patch of earth just outside the shed, where grass grew green and undisturbed, and no signs of panic or flight had marked the soil, and she murmured to herself, "How very odd. Fires usually burn much hotter, don't they? Unless someone didn't want it to." With that, she took a half step back and allowed the others to crowd forward, her hands folded in front of her, demure as ever. But the thoughts in her mind had already begun their quiet procession. A man had died, yes, but not in the way he was meant to. And Miss Marple, who had lived long enough to know that evil often wore the face of respectability, suspected this fate was about to become most unpleasant. Miss Marple did not linger at the shed after that initial, dispassionate glance. Others, of course, surged forward. The vicar with his mild protestations, Mrs. Calthorpe trying to shield the more sensitive ladies from the sight, though none appeared truly eager to look away. The constable, young Harold Finch, had already been summoned by an enthusiastic boy sent running to the village green and several people were arguing whether they ought to touch the scene or not. Miss Marple knew better. She made her way quietly to a nearby bench beneath an elm tree, removed her gloves, and sat with her hands folded in her lap, observing, listening. There is something peculiar about the way a village digests a death, especially one that arrives uninvited, sudden, and in full daylight. As the hours stretched into early evening, the fete dissolved with uncanny speed. Bunting was lowered, pastries forgotten, and laughter replaced by low, anxious murmurs. One by one, people peeled away, glancing back over their shoulders as they made excuses to return home. It was not the first time Miss Marple had seen such retreat. In St. Mary Mead, she had once likened it to a hedgehog folding into itself when startled. People did not flee in panic. Rather, they withdrew, pulling their curtains tight and their secrets closer. And yet, despite this instinct to close ranks, tongues would wag. Luffington Bales was no exception. By the time Constable Finch cordoned off the tool shed with a bit of rope and an impressive frown, speculation had already spread from the vicarage to the bakery and beyond. "I heard it was suicide," said Mrs. Pendry to the grocer's wife. "He's been ever so strange these past weeks," muttering to himself. "Suicide, my foot," replied the grocer's wife. "He'd just won that land contract for the tennis courts. Why would he go and kill himself now?" At the Piebald Horse, the local pub, the story twisted again. Someone claimed Mr. Denham had been involved in a blackmail scheme. Another insisted he'd had a heated argument with a certain gentleman about boundary lines on the East Field, though no one seemed certain who that gentleman had been by nightfall. Luffington Bales was ablaze with theories, none of them particularly well-reasoned. Miss Marple, on the other hand, spent her evening in the vicarage parlour, knitting by the lamplight while Mrs. Calthorpe tried to soothe her nerves by recounting every known moral failing of the deceased. "Of course," she said, pouring tea with trembling hands, "I never liked Mr. Denham. There was always something slippery about him. Oh, polite enough when he wanted to be, but he treated Edith as if she were a bit of furniture, and he always brought those dreadful cigarettes, foreign things with a horrible smell. I dare say they contributed to the fire." Miss Marple looked up from her knitting. "Did he often smoke in the shed?" "Well, I don't know," admitted Mrs. Calthorpe, faltering. "I suppose it's possible, though what he was doing in there at all is quite beyond me." "It's the vicar's shed after all." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "That is rather curious." The next morning brought official confirmation. The man found in the shed was indeed Lionel Denham. Dr. Pembroke had been called in late and provided an early opinion, though he appeared less than fully satisfied. "Burned," he told Finch grimly, "but oddly. There's damage, certainly, some charring to the hands and coat, but the body wasn't consumed in the way I'd expect. Fire didn't burn hot enough or long enough. Odd business. Bit of smoke inhalation perhaps, but I'll have to wait on more details." Constable Finch, eager to be seen doing something meaningful, nodded, as if he understood. He'd been pacing between the shed and the vicarage all morning, determined to piece together a narrative. His current theory leaned heavily on the notion of accidental fire. Perhaps he was tinkering with something and knocked over a lamp, he told Reverend Calthorpe, who nodded half-heartedly. "Tools everywhere. Paper. You know how these things start." "But the only lamp in there," said the vicar slowly, "was broken last winter. I never replaced it." "Oh," said Finch. "Well, perhaps he brought one with him then." Miss Marple, seated on the rectory's side porch with her morning tea, heard the exchange and made no comment. But her eyes lingered on the young constable's face a moment longer than politeness required. It was not that she wished to make the man uncomfortable, he was earnest if inexperienced, but rather that she found people tended to reveal more in what they tried not to say. After luncheon, she made a quiet visit to the Pendry household, ostensibly to deliver a potted cutting Mrs. Calthorpe had promised. Mildred Pendry accepted it with her usual brittle politeness, barely disguising her desire to get back to polishing the brass bell at the hearth. "I suppose everyone's quite undone over poor Mr. Denham," Miss Marple offered gently. Mildred gave a thin smile. "He wasn't poor, nor was he liked. Still, one doesn't expect to be incinerated on a summer afternoon." "No," Mildred agreed, then looked over her shoulder to be sure her husband wasn't nearby. "Arthur saw him yesterday morning, you know. Out by the green, they had words." "About what?" "Oh, some nonsense about the hedgerow again. Lionel insisted the property line had been moved during the war. Some dispute over inches, really. Arthur was furious. Said he'd dig up the whole wretched hedge and plant poppies instead." Miss Marple did not comment. She thanked Mildred for the tea and promised to return her dishcloths next week. Later that afternoon, she passed by the shed again. It remained under the constable's watch, and the door was now secured. But Miss Marple wasn't particularly interested in the scene itself. She was far more intrigued by the people who came and stood near it, often thinking themselves unseen. Mrs. Evangeline Carroway stood there just after 4 o'clock, holding a lace-trimmed handkerchief to her lips. She did not weep, but her posture was strikingly still. One might even say mournful, if one were inclined to believe she mourned at all. Miss Marple stood at a distance behind the lilac bush and watched as Evangeline leaned ever so slightly toward the door, as though she could hear something behind. It then, as if aware she was no longer alone, Evangeline straightened her shoulders and walked briskly away. Miss Marple tilted her head. Evangeline's gloves were immaculate, but there were black smudges on the hem of her cream linen skirt. She made a note of it. That evening the post came. A letter from London, addressed to Lionel Denham, arrived at the vicarage by mistake. Evidently, he'd been using the rectory as a drop address. The maid Edith, now pale but composed, brought it to Miss Marple, thinking it belonged to Mrs. Calthorpe. "Do you know who Miss Thalia Carroway is?" the girl asked, puzzled by the name on the return address. "I thought Mrs. Carroway's only sister died years ago." Miss Marple took the letter gently and turned it over. A name in flowing, theatrical script. A London address in Chelsea. The envelope was sealed with wax. She smiled faintly. "Oh, yes," she said. "I dare say this will become most illuminating." And with that, she tucked it carefully into her handbag and resumed her knitting. Miss Marple sat by the window of the vicarage parlour, the afternoon sun casting soft light across her knitting. The letter from London rested unopened beside her. On the table, its presence a small, weighty reminder that mysteries often carried roots far beyond the immediate soil. She fingered the seal absently, allowing her mind to drift back over the day's events, stitching together impressions much like her wool. Outside, the village of Luffington Bales continued its subdued rhythm, the initial shock of Lionel Denham's death settling into a restless hum of gossip and speculation. But for Miss Marple, the real work had only just begun. Death by fire was rarely simple, especially when the flames seemed reluctant to do their destructive work fully. When the postman had arrived, Edith had brought the letter with a mixture of curiosity and nervousness. She had been with the vicarage only a few weeks, still fresh to the ways of the village and its unspoken hierarchies. Miss Marple had gently reassured her and suggested the letter might well reveal something important. But the letter was more than just paper and wax. It was a silent invitation to untangle threads tangled long ago. At tea, the vicar's wife had been lively despite the sombre mood, asking Miss Marple about her knitting and lamenting how the village would never quite feel safe again. Miss Marple had smiled politely but made no reply. Safety, she reflected, was an illusion that often blinded people to what was hidden beneath polite surfaces. Later, as twilight deepened, she found herself drawn to the garden shed again. Though the constable's rope was still in place, the crowd had thinned. The evening air was cooler now, carrying a faint scent of lavender from Mrs. Pendry's garden next door. Miss Marple's eyes swept the scene. noting the faint smudges on the linen skirt Evangeline Carroway had worn earlier. It was a small detail, but such details often spoke louder than words. Miss Marple decided it was time to speak to Mrs. Carroway herself. She had the quiet assurance of a woman used to navigating delicate social waters, and she knew the importance of approaching a subject with care. She chose to call on Evangeline the next morning. Mrs. Carroway answered the door promptly, her composure flawless as ever. Her pale cheeks bore the slightest flush, either from the morning chill or some other stirring within. "Miss Marple, how kind of you," she said, stepping aside to admit her visitor. The drawing-room was immaculate, decorated with tasteful portraits and a large mirror that seemed to watch silently. "I hope I'm not intruding," Miss Marple said as she settled into a velvet armchair. "I was just passing and thought it might be proper to offer my condolences again." "Thank you. It's been difficult, but we all must carry on." Evangeline's voice was steady, but Miss Marple caught the shadow in her eyes. There was a pause, a delicate silence filled with things unsaid. Then Miss Marple carefully began, "I couldn't help but notice some smudges on your skirt yesterday near the shed. It struck me as unusual, though I'm sure there's a simple explanation." Evangeline's eyes flickered, a momentary crack in her perfect mask. "Oh, that. I was helping move some of the flower pots near the tool shed yesterday morning. There's always a bit of soil, you understand." "Yes, I do," Miss Marple said quietly, "but it's not often I see soil so near a place that caught fire. Did you notice anything unusual when you were there?" Evangeline hesitated before answering. "No, nothing at all. The shed seemed quiet. I left as soon as I finished." Miss Marple nodded slowly, though she suspected there was more behind. Those carefully chosen words. It's funny, isn't it, how the most ordinary places can hold the most extraordinary secrets. Evangeline's lips twitched in what might have been a smile, or a warning. Before leaving, Miss Marple took the opportunity to mention the letter found among Mr. Denham's belongings. "I received a letter addressed to him from Chelsea. Do you know anyone there who might have written to him?" Evangeline's posture stiffened imperceptibly, and she glanced away. "No, I can't say I do. Lionel kept his correspondence private." "Of course," Miss Marple said, rising. "Thank you for your time, Mrs. Carroway. If you think of anything, do let me know." As the door closed behind her, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to the letter. There was something about that name, Thalia Carroway, that seemed significant. A sister, perhaps. A rival. She resolved to open the letter at once. Back at the vicarage, Miss Marple carefully broke the seal. The handwriting inside was elegant, but urgent, the words hinting at old grievances and hidden truths. "Dear Lionel, you cannot keep hiding in Luffington Bales forever. The past will catch up with you, and when it does, there will be no escape. We both know what happened in Chelsea, and you will answer for it. This is your final warning." Miss Marple read the letter twice, her mind turning over the possibilities. Chelsea was not just a place. It was a world away from this quiet village, yet its shadows had apparently followed Lionel Denham here. Was this warning linked to the fire? Was the tool shed more than just a garden storehouse? She folded the letter carefully and placed it in her handbag. This was no longer a simple case of accidental death. Someone had wanted Lionel Denham silenced. The next morning, Miss Marple visited the village's few shops, listening closely to the ebb and flow of rumour. At the bakery, she overheard Mrs. Grayson mentioning the argument between Denham and Arthur Pendry. At the butcher's, Mr. Holmes spoke of Denham's growing enemies among the landowners. At the post office, Edith confided that she had seen Evangeline Carroway near the shed just before the fire was discovered. Each snippet was a thread, and Miss Marple's mind wove them into a tapestry of motives and opportunities. Later that day, she arranged to meet Arthur Pendry. The man was brusque and ill at ease, his heavy hands betraying his attempts at calm. Over tea in his modest sitting room, he spoke candidly. "Yes," I argued with Denham, "he's always been a thorn in my side, claiming property rights, threatening to push the village into changes none of us wanted." "Did it ever go beyond words?" Miss Marple asked gently. Arthur's jaw tightened. "No, I'm no murderer, just a frustrated man." She studied him, noting the weariness beneath the rough exterior. But there was no sign of the hatred one might expect from a killer. In the days that followed, Miss Marple continued to piece together the lives entwined with Lionel Denham's. There was Edith, the timid maid whose loyalty seemed torn, the vicar's wife, anxious and protective. Colonel Arbuthnot, who bore his own grudges quietly, and Evangeline Carroway, with her impeccable gloves and smudged skirt. Late one afternoon, while returning from a visit to the village school, Miss Marple noticed the faintest curl of smoke rising behind the hedge near the tool shed. She approached, cautiously, but found nothing more than a discarded cigarette butt on the ground. "Strange," she murmured, picking it up. The tobacco was foreign, much like the type Mrs. Calthorpe had mentioned. Not a common brand in the village. With that small clue tucked away, Miss Marple sat once more by her window, her knitting needles clicking softly. The fire had not burned hot enough to consume all evidence, but it had ignited something far more dangerous, a web of deceit long held under the surface, now threatening to erupt. The village of Luffington Bales was no longer peaceful, and Miss Marple knew that in the days to come, more secrets would come to light. But for now, she waited, as only she could, letting the quiet settle around her, her mind sharp and ready to unravel the truth hidden behind the fire that didn't burn hot enough. The days grew heavier with a slow, creeping tension that threaded itself through the daily rhythms of Luffington Bales. Miss Marple noticed it in the furtive glances exchanged at the market, in the lowered voices at the bakery, and in the cautious way villagers crossed the green, avoiding the tool shed's shadow as if it were a wound still fresh and bleeding. On a grey morning, Miss Marple found herself walking toward the shed once again. The rope had been replaced with proper police tape, but the scene remained curiously untouched. It was as if everyone hesitated to disturb the mystery, hoping it would resolve itself, or perhaps fearing what the truth might reveal. The vicar had invited her for a cup of tea after morning prayers, and as she passed the parish church, she noted the faint echo of the choir practicing for Sunday service. The village appeared outwardly calm, but beneath that calm, the current of suspicion ran swift and deep. At the vicarage, Miss Marple was greeted with a quiet welcome. Reverend Calthorpe's mild manner suited the troubled times, and his wife was as warm as ever, though the worry lines around her eyes betrayed the strain of recent events. "Have you heard any more, dear?" Mrs. Calthorpe asked as she poured tea. Miss Marple shook her head gently. "Only that there are as many theories as there are villagers." But no answers. The vicar sighed. "It's troubling. Lionel Denham was a complicated man, not easily loved. Yet no one wanted this." Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. "Indeed. Sometimes those we think least capable are the ones who hide their true selves best." Her mind circled back to the letter from Chelsea, the threatening words, still vivid in her memory. She wondered about the elusive Thalia Carroway, who she might be, and what role she played in the tangled story of Lionel Denham's life. After tea, Miss Marple decided to visit Edith, the young maid who had brought the letter. Edith was a nervous girl, whose timid eyes seemed to carry a burden she struggled to bear. She found Edith at the post office, arranging parcels with trembling hands. The girl looked up, startled but glad to see a familiar, kindly face. "Miss Marple," Edith whispered, "I didn't know where else to go." "Come now, Edith. What troubles you?" The girl hesitated, then confessed, I saw something, or thought I did. The night before the fire, I noticed Evangeline Carroway near the shed, but it wasn't just her. I thought I saw someone else, someone in the shadows." Miss Marple's interest piqued. "Did you see who it was?" Edith shook her head. "No, it was too dark. But there was a muffled argument. I heard voices, raised voices, and then a sudden silence. I was too scared to stay." "Did you tell anyone?" "No, I didn't want to cause trouble." Miss Marple placed a reassuring hand on Edith's arm. "You did the right thing to tell me now. Sometimes the smallest whispers lead to the loudest truths." With this new piece of the puzzle, Miss Marple felt the strands drawing tighter. She resolved to observe Evangeline Carroway more closely, suspecting that the immaculate gloves and poised manner masked deeper secrets. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple took a stroll toward the edge of the village where the Carroway estate stood. A stately house of brick and ivy, elegant yet imposing. She had been invited there once or twice before, but today she was simply a curious observer, blending into the gathering dusk. Through the tall iron gates, she saw Evangeline moving gracefully across the garden, speaking softly with a tall man, whose back was to her. They seemed absorbed in conversation, their heads close together. Miss Marple strained to catch a word, but heard only a fragment. "Must be careful. Too much at stake." The man turned suddenly, revealing a face. Miss Marple recognized Colonel Arbuthnot. The retired army officer, known for his stern demeanor and sharp mind, had recently returned to the village and had become involved in various local affairs. Miss Marple watched as Evangeline's expression shifted. Something like a flicker of impatience crossed her features before she masked it with a polite smile. The colonel nodded solemnly and took his leave. Evangeline lingered a moment longer, then retreated into the house. This brief encounter set Miss Marple's thoughts racing. What was the connection between Evangeline and Colonel Arbuthnot? What secret did their whispered talk conceal? The following day, Miss Marple arranged to visit Colonel Arbuthnot, under the pretense of seeking advice about local history for a book she was researching. The colonel welcomed her with the courteous reserve of a man accustomed to social niceties, but also eager to engage in serious discussion. "I've heard troubling news about the fire, Miss Marple," he said, pouring tea with deliberate care. "Such an odd circumstance, this death of Denham's." "Yes," she agreed. "It's peculiar how the fire never burned hot enough. One wonders if it was set with intention, or if something else prevented it from spreading." The colonel leaned forward. "There are many in the village who had grievances against Denham. Land disputes, old grudges, even some whispered debts. But murder? That is a serious accusation." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled slightly. "True, but often murder is simply the most extreme expression of those old grudges." They discussed various villagers, including Arthur Pendry and Evangeline Carroway, their names surfacing naturally in conversation. The colonel was cautious but observant, revealing bits of information that Miss Marple filed away. Before leaving, Miss Marple mentioned the letter from Chelsea, gauging the colonel's reaction. He frowned. "Chelsea? That suggests connections outside our quiet village. I wonder what past Mr. Denham carried with him here." Miss Marple smiled gently. "That's precisely what I intend to find out." As she walked back through the village, the clouds gathered, casting long shadows. The sky threatened rain, as if the heavens themselves were uneasy about the secrets yet to be uncovered. Back at the vicarage that evening, Miss Marple sat by the fire, knitting needles clicking steadily as she reviewed her notes. The pieces were beginning to fit, but there were still gaps, questions that hovered like spectres at the edge of her understanding. Why had Denham used the vicarage address? What did the letter mean by what happened in Chelsea, and who exactly had been arguing with Evangeline in the shadows? Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Edith, looking pale but resolute. "Miss Marple, I thought you should know. There's been talk that someone saw Mr. Denham meeting a stranger at the village inn the week before he died." "A stranger?" Miss Marple asked, setting aside her knitting. "Yes, someone unfamiliar to most of us. They say he looked anxious, almost frightened." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "Thank you, Edith. That is most helpful." The next morning, Miss Marple made her way to the Piebald Horse. The innkeeper, Mr. Talbot, was a sturdy man with a keen eye and a quick wit. "Good morning, Mr. Talbot. Might I ask if you noticed any visitors last week who seemed out of place?" "Ew." Innkeeper thought for a moment. "There was a gentleman, dressed rather sharply, stayed a couple of nights, didn't say much, kept to himself mostly, had some hushed talks with Mr. Denham from what I heard." "Did he leave before the fire?" "Yes, a day or two earlier. Left in a hurry, they say." Miss Marple thanked him and stepped outside, her mind swirling. A mysterious visitor, a threatening letter, arguments in the shadows. Each detail pointed to a web of intrigue that stretched beyond the boundaries of the village. That afternoon, as the rain began to fall in fine mist, Miss Marple found herself once again before the tool shed, the yellow tape fluttering in the breeze. Her fingers brushed the pocket of her coat where the letter rested, a tangible link to the darkness that had crept into Luffington Bales. She knew now that the fire was a message, and the murder a carefully veiled act. It was not the flames themselves that were most telling, but the coldness beneath, a coldness that only human hearts could kindle, and Miss Marple was ready to follow that cold trail wherever it might lead. The rain fell steadily through the night, drumming a steady rhythm against the windows of the vicarage, blurring the edges of the quiet village beyond. Miss Marple sat by the fire, the soft glow warming her face as she reread the letter from Chelsea once more. Each word seemed to carry a weight that pressed deeper into her thoughts, refusing to be dismissed as mere threat or empty menace. Morning brought a brittle chill, the kind that sharpened the senses and pried open the cracks of secrecy. Miss Marple decided that to unravel the past held in that letter, she needed to understand the man Lionel Denham had been before he settled in Luffington Bales. The quiet village had been a refuge, but shadows evidently followed him here. Her first call was to the post office, where Edith greeted her with a hopeful smile. Encouraged by their recent conversation, Edith confided something new. "Miss Marple, I found a small package among Mr. Denham's things hidden under some papers. It was addressed to T. Carraway and contained a faded photograph." Curious, Miss Marple asked to see it. Edith carefully unfolded the package and revealed a sepia-toned image of two young women standing side by side in a Chelsea garden. One was unmistakably Evangeline Carraway. The other was a stranger with dark eyes and a stubborn set to her jaw. Could this be Thalia? Miss Marple studied the photograph with interest. The contrast between the two women spoke volumes. The confidence in Evangeline's posture, the guarded defiance in the other. It was a silent portrait of a fractured past. "Do you know who this might be?" Miss Marple asked Edith. "I don't think anyone in the village knows much about Thalia." "Evangeline never speaks of her," that silence was telling. The village's poised and polished Evangeline carried secrets that Miss Marple felt certain would soon come to light. The day's errands led Miss Marple to the village library, a small room lined with weathered volumes and the faint smell of dust and ink. She hoped to find mention of Chelsea or any local newspapers that might shed light on Mr. Denham's history. The librarian, a sharp-eyed woman named Mrs. Pevensey, was both obliging and intrigued. "Chelsea, you say? Let me see." She pulled out a worn volume of local papers and flicked through the brittle pages. Here is something from a decade ago. A report of a scandal involving a fire at a Chelsea estate, an unsolved death, and Accusations of betrayal among close family. Miss Marple's heart quickened. The details were fragmentary but familiar. The fire, the accusation, the letter's chilling warning. She made notes meticulously, each fact a step closer to unveiling. The tangled web around Lionel Denham. Later she sought out the vicar, who had access to old parish records. Between them they uncovered that Lionel Denham's real surname had been Sinclair, and that he had left Chelsea under a cloud of suspicion. His sister Thalia missing, presumed estranged after a bitter family quarrel. It seems the past you speak of did not stay buried, the vicar observed gravely. No, Reverend, Miss Marple said. It is very much alive, and I suspect it holds the key to the fire at the shed, and to the murder. Miss Marple's thoughts returned to Evangeline. Caraway. If Thalia was her sister, what had driven them apart? And why had Evangeline come to Luffington Bales carrying a polished exterior, but evidently haunted by old wounds? That afternoon, Miss Marple visited the Caraway estate once more, this time under the guise of returning the photograph to Edith, for safekeeping, but with a clear intention to confront Evangeline indirectly. She arrived as Evangeline was preparing to leave for a social gathering. The woman greeted her with a practiced warmth, but Miss Marple noted the slight tension in her smile. Mrs. Caraway, I hope you don't mind my curiosity, but I came to ask about your sister, Thalia, Miss Marple began gently. Evangeline's composure faltered for a split second, just enough for Miss Marple to see the flicker of pain. Thalia and I were close once, but that was many years ago. It's best left in the past. Did it involve the fire in Chelsea, by any chance? Miss Marple inquired carefully. Evangeline hesitated, then shook her head. I cannot speak of it. It is a chapter I have tried to close. Miss Marple smiled understandingly. Sometimes the past refuses to stay closed. It has a way of coming back, especially when secrets are involved. Evangeline's gaze sharpened. Are you suggesting my family is involved in Lionel Denham's death? Miss Marple replied with her usual gentle steadiness. I merely observe that where there is smoke, there is often fire, and in this case more than one. The conversation ended politely, but the undercurrent of tension was unmistakable. The following day, Miss Marple found herself drawn back to the village green, where Arthur Pendry was seated on a bench, smoking heavily. The lines on his face deepened as he looked up. Miss Marple, he greeted with a grunt, you seem to be everywhere these days. I'm simply trying to understand the village better, she replied. May I sit? He nodded, and she settled beside him. After a pause, she ventured, I hear you had disagreements with Mr. Denham over land matters. Arthur's eyes narrowed. He was trying to take what he thought was his. I couldn't allow that. But a fight? No. I was angry, yes, but not murderous. Miss Marple studied him, noting the mix of frustration and weariness. Sometimes anger can blind us, Mr. Pendry, but the truth eventually cuts through the haze. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the local constable, who approached with a new report. Miss Marple, we've found something near the tool shed, a piece of fabric caught on a nail. It's from a glove not belonging to Mrs. Caraway. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. Interesting. Whose glove might that be? The constable shook his head. We don't know yet, but it could belong to someone who was there the night of the fire. Miss Marple's mind raced. Each discovery was like a carefully placed stitch, bringing the pattern of the mystery into clearer focus. She felt the web tightening, the hidden motives rising to the surface like ghosts demanding recognition. That evening, as twilight deepened, Miss Marple sat once more in the vicarage parlour, the flickering fire casting long shadows. She thought of the villagers, each carrying their own secrets and fears, of the stranger at the inn, the whispered arguments, and the half-truths spoken behind closed doors. She understood now that the fire had been both a warning and a smokescreen, concealing a crime rooted not in passion alone, but in the cold calculations of old grievances. With patience and quiet determination, Miss Marple prepared to follow the subtle signs that would lead her to the heart of the mystery, knowing full well that the real truth would be stranger and darker than any of them dared imagine. The morning air was crisp and sharp as Miss Marple set out once again, the weight of her thoughts pressing gently yet insistently upon her. The village seemed to hold its breath, the usual hum of everyday life subdued beneath the shadow of recent events. Each step toward the village green was a step deeper into a maze woven of half-truths and delicate pretenses. She found herself drawn to the spot near the tool shed where the torn glove had been discovered. The glove, a dark leather affair, was nondescript enough to belong to any man or woman of the village, but it was the fabric caught upon the nail that intrigued Miss Marple. The tear was clean, as though the glove had been snagged deliberately, or, in the frantic struggle of a moment, the constable, Mr. Harrow, was on duty nearby, watching the cordoned-off area with a mixture of vigilance and weariness. When Miss Marple approached, he greeted her with a nod. "I trust you found the glove as interesting as we did, Miss Marple," she smiled gently. "Indeed, Mr. Harrow, but it's often the smallest things that unravel the biggest mysteries." He glanced at her with a hint of respect. "Any idea whose it might be?" "Not yet," she said thoughtfully, "but I intend to find out." Her next visit was to Mrs. Penrose, the village dressmaker, known for her meticulous attention to detail and intimate knowledge of everyone's attire. Mrs. Penrose welcomed Miss Marple warmly, though there was a flicker of nervousness in her eyes, as if the latest developments weighed heavily upon her. "Good morning, Miss Marple. What can I do for you today?" she asked, setting down a spool of thread. "I was hoping you might help me identify the maker of this glove," Miss Marple said, producing the torn leather piece carefully wrapped in tissue. Mrs. Penrose examined it under the light, running, her fingers over the supple leather. "A fine piece, certainly. Not common around here. This sort of glove is bespoke, likely from London. Not the sort you find at a local market. Do you have any customers who might own gloves like these?" Thought for a moment. "Evangeline Carroway is known to wear such gloves. Also, Colonel Arbuthnot is particular about his attire. And, of course, Mrs. Denham used to have gloves like this before she left the village." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Thank you, Mrs. Penrose. Your insight is invaluable." As she left the shop, her mind turned to the new information. The gloves could belong to any one of several individuals, all of whom had reason to be near the shed that night. The village was a delicate ecosystem of interwoven relationships, and each thread Miss Marple pulled revealed more complexity. Later that afternoon she arranged a meeting with Colonel Arbuthnot. The colonel received her with his usual blend of courtesy and reserve, though a flicker of impatience flashed in his eyes as she mentioned the glove. "Do you suggest I had anything to do with Mr. Denham's death?" he asked sharply. "Not at all, Colonel. But your name has come up in connection with several recent discoveries," Miss Marple said quietly. "Might I ask if you were near the tool shed on the night in question?" The colonel's expression hardened. "I was on the estate grounds, yes. I had a disagreement with Mr. Denham over a matter of mutual concern. And that was some old business from my army days. I wanted to ensure no trouble followed. Me here." He paused, then added, "I left before the fire started." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully, sensing that the colonel's answers, while truthful, were deliberately restrained. The next day the village was abuzz with news. Evangeline. Carroway had agreed to speak with Miss Marple privately. The invitation came as a surprise, given Evangeline's usual guarded nature. Miss Marple found her at the Carroway estate, standing by the window with a distant look. "I appreciate your willingness to talk, Mrs. Carroway," Miss Marple began, gently. "I know these times are difficult," Evangeline nodded. I do not deny I have secrets, Miss Marple, but the past is a place I try not to revisit. Understandable, Miss Marple said, but sometimes understanding the past helps us make sense of the present. Evangeline sighed. Very well, Thalia was my sister, as you suspected. We were close once, but after the fire in Chelsea, everything changed. Miss Marple waited patiently as Evangeline recounted a story tinged with sorrow and regret. A family torn apart by jealousy, betrayal, and a love triangle that ended in tragedy. Thalia, accused of setting the fire that claimed their childhood home and fractured their family, disappeared soon after, leaving a trail of questions and bitterness. I believed her guilty for a long time, Evangeline admitted. But now, after meeting Mr. Denham, I fear the truth is more complicated. Miss Marple's interest deepened. What do you mean? Lionel, Mr. Denham, was involved with Thalia before he came here. They shared secrets, promises. He carried a burden from those days. And you think this burden led to his death? Evangeline's gaze dropped. I do. Miss Marple saw the flicker of pain in her eyes and understood that this revelation had shaken even the most composed of villagers. Her next visit was to Arthur Pendry, who seemed less guarded after the news of Evangeline's confession. They spoke at length about old grievances, about land disputes and petty jealousies that had simmered beneath the village's polite surface for years. You see, Miss Marple, Arthur said with a grim smile, Luffington Bales is not as peaceful as it seems. Everyone has something to hide. Miss Marple nodded. And sometimes the quietest voices conceal the darkest secrets. That evening, as she returned home, she felt the weight of the village's tangled history settling over her like a thick fog. The fire at the shed was no accident. It was a carefully orchestrated act designed to both threaten and conceal. The torn glove, the letter from Chelsea, the whispered arguments, all pointed toward a conspiracy that stretched far beyond a simple crime of passion. Yet the truth remained elusive, hidden beneath layers of deceit and fear. As the village slept under the watchful eye of a silver moon, Miss Marple sat by her window, knitting needles clicking softly. She knew the next steps would require patience and subtlety, observing reactions, probing for inconsistencies, and, most importantly, listening to what was left unsaid. The heart of the mystery beat quietly but steadily, waiting for the moment when it would reveal itself in full. And Miss Marple was ready to meet it with the calm resolve of one who understands that in human nature, nothing is ever quite as simple as it seems. The days that followed passed in a haze of rain and mist, the village of Luffington Bales cloaked in an atmosphere both sombre and tense. Miss Marple found herself increasingly aware of how the delicate veneer of civility was beginning to crack, exposing raw nerves and old wounds that the murder had only scratched open. Everyone was watching one another with wary eyes, and even the usual chatter in the tea rooms carried an undercurrent of suspicion. Yet Miss Marple remained calm, her keen mind piecing together the subtle shifts in behaviour that the rest seemed either unable or unwilling to notice. The torn glove, the shadow of Chelsea's past, the fractured Carraway sisters, all were parts of a puzzle whose edges were still blurry, but whose centre was growing sharper. One afternoon, as she strolled through the village, Miss Marple's path took her past the village hall, where a small crowd had gathered. Curiosity piqued. She paused to listen. The topic of conversation was a recent, strange occurrence, the disappearance of some personal belongings from the Carraway estate. Nothing valuable, just trinkets and papers. Yet it was enough to stir unease. Miss Marple's thoughts were immediately drawn to the possibility that the theft was connected to the murder. It wasn't uncommon for a criminal to revisit a scene or target an individual in an attempt to destroy evidence or unsettle others. That evening, she decided to visit the local inn, where the villagers often gathered after a long day. The fire crackled warmly as Miss Marple took her usual seat near the hearth. There she found Arthur Pendry nursing a glass of ale, his expression less guarded than usual. "Evening, Miss Marple," he greeted, lifting his glass. "This village is getting more complicated by the day." "Indeed, Mr. Pendry," she agreed gently. "I hear there's been a theft at the Caraway estate." He nodded grimly. "Yes, nothing valuable, but enough to make Evangeline more unsettled than before. She keeps to herself these days, hardly even at church." Miss Marple's mind raced. The theft might be a diversion or a message. Either way, it was a new piece in the unfolding drama. As the evening progressed, she noticed a newcomer to the village, a man with a sharp gaze and carefully measured movements. Introduced to her as Mr. Julian Hawkes, he claimed to be a historian researching old estates in the area. Yet something about his presence unsettled Miss Marple. Perhaps it was the way his eyes flicked too quickly over faces, or the ease with which he slipped in and out of conversations unnoticed. Miss Marple made a mental note to learn more about Mr. Hawkes. The following morning, a letter arrived at the vicarage, unsigned but carefully penned. It hinted at knowing the truth behind the murder and warned Miss Marple to cease her inquiries. Far from deterring her, the letter sharpened her resolve. She visited Reverend Collins to share the message, and the two agreed that the threat, while veiled, was serious. The village's tranquil surface was more fragile than ever. Later, Miss Marple arranged a discreet meeting with Evangeline Caraway. In the privacy of her drawing room, Evangeline revealed that the theft had disturbed her deeply, especially as some old letters and documents concerning her family's Chelsea past had gone missing. "It feels as though someone is trying to erase the past," Evangeline said softly. "But the past does not so easily vanish." Miss Marple nodded. "It often has a way of asserting itself, especially when lives depend on it." Their conversation was interrupted by a sudden knock at the door. Evangeline's face paled slightly as a familiar figure entered. Julian Hawkes. "I hope I'm not intruding," he said smoothly, "but I wanted to speak with you about some of those documents." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The historian's interest in the Caraway family suddenly seemed more than academic. Throughout the afternoon, Miss Marple observed the interactions closely. Hawkes's questions were probing, veiled in politeness but edged with an urgency that suggested he was searching for something or someone. As twilight deepened, Miss Marple left the estate with a clear sense that the mystery was tightening around the Caraways, and that the threads of Chelsea's dark past were entwining more deeply with the present than anyone had dared to admit. Back at the vicarage, Miss Marple reflected on the day's events. The letter, the theft, Hawkes's arrival, each was a deliberate move in a subtle game of chess. The players were cautious but no less determined. She resolved to delve further into Hawkes's background, suspecting that beneath the guise of historian lay a connection to the shadows that still clung to the village and its residents. The quiet of the night was a thin veil over a village alive with secrets, and Miss Marple, as ever, was listening carefully for the truth hidden in the silences. The days stretched on with the relentless, muted rhythm of village life pressed beneath the weight of hidden tensions. Miss Marple, ever watchful, found her, thoughts returning again and again to the newcomer, Julian Hawkes. His arrival, under the guise of a benign historian, seemed too calculated, too convenient given the recent disturbances. One afternoon she ventured to the local library, a modest but well-kept repository of village history and genealogical records. There, amidst the musty pages and dusty ledgers, she hoped to uncover more about Mr. Hawkes. The librarian, Miss Frobisher, was a fount of local knowledge, and after a brief polite inquiry, she revealed that Julian Hawkes had not been seen in Luffington Bales before his recent arrival. Moreover, a search through regional archives showed no record of his prior research or publications, a curious absence for someone claiming to be a historian. Miss Marple noted this quietly, filing it away as a detail demanding closer attention. Later, that evening, she invited Reverend Collins for tea at her cottage. They discussed the troubling developments from the theft to the ominous letter. "Whoever sent that letter clearly wishes to intimidate you," the vicar said gravely, looking at Miss Marple over his spectacles. "Yes, but threats seldom succeed in deterring those who seek truth," she replied with a small smile. "I believe the letter was meant to draw a line, a warning to cease investigation. Yet it also tells me we are closer to uncovering something important." Reverend Collins nodded. "This village holds many secrets beneath its surface. The tragedy of the Caraway sisters, the fire in Chelsea, and now these recent events. They feel intertwined." Miss Marple took a sip of her tea, eyes distant but focused. "Precisely. And I intend to untangle those threads." The next day, Miss Marple arranged a discreet meeting with Arthur Pendry at the village green, hoping to gather more about the community's undercurrents. Arthur, who had become more forthcoming since their last conversation, revealed whispers of resentment toward Lionel Denham's arrival. Some villagers regarded him as an interloper, others as a man carrying a dubious past. Arthur himself had his own reasons for unease, stemming from old land disputes that had never quite settled. "It's not just what Mr. Denham did," Arthur explained, "but what he represented. A disruption to the established order. When you live in a place like Luffington Bales, change is always met with suspicion." Miss Marple considered this, understanding how fragile the balance was between tradition and change. Such a balance, she knew, could easily tip into conflict. That afternoon, she found herself invited to the Caraway estate once again. Evangeline greeted her with a mixture of relief and apprehension, her composure fragile beneath the surface. "There is something you should see," Evangeline said, leading Miss Marple to a small study lined with books and papers. She handed her a faded photograph of two young women standing side by side, faces solemn but unmistakably sisters. "Thalia and I, years ago, before everything fell apart." Miss Marple studied the image carefully. The eyes of the younger Thalia seemed to hold a secret, an unspoken sorrow that time had not dimmed. "There was more to that fire in Chelsea than has been said," Evangeline whispered, "and Mr. Denham knew it. I believe he feared what might come to light." As dusk settled, Miss Marple left the estate with a renewed sense of purpose. She felt the invisible strands tightening, weaving a story of fear, betrayal, and the desperate desire to bury painful truths. Her next step was to observe Julian Hawkes more closely. She began attending local gatherings where he was likely to appear, watching how he interacted with the villagers. His manner remained polished but aloof, his questions probing yet careful. At times she noticed a flicker of impatience, as though he was searching for a key that eluded him. One evening, at the village hall, where a small fundraising event was underway, Miss Marple found herself beside Hawkes near the refreshment table. She offered a gentle remark about the village's resilience. "Yes," he replied smoothly, "but resilience often hides fractures beneath." His words lingered in her mind as she observed him further, noting the subtle glances he cast toward Evangeline Caraway across the room. Their connection was undeniable, though the nature of it remained unclear. Later that week, a sudden incident sent a ripple of alarm through Luffington Bales. A fire broke out in the old barn near the Caraway estate, the same barn where the earlier fire had been suspected. Though quickly contained, the flames left blackened wood and frightened whispers in their wake. Miss Marple arrived at the scene shortly after the fire brigade had done their work. She examined the charred remains with careful eyes. The fire's origin seemed deliberate. Accelerants had been used, she suspected, pointing to arson rather than accident. "This is no coincidence," she told the constable. Someone is sending a message or trying to cover their tracks. The villagers gathered nearby, their faces a mix of fear and anger. Evangeline was among them, pale but composed, her gaze fixed on the ruins. Miss Marple approached her gently. "Are you all right, Mrs. Carroway?" Evangeline's voice was steady, though touched with sadness. "I fear this will not be the last sign of what is to come." As the night deepened, Miss Marple sat by the fire in her cottage, contemplating the pattern emerging from the chaos, the fires, the theft, the threats. They were all pieces of a larger design, a desperate attempt to silence the past and those who sought to reveal it. Her thoughts turned to the villagers, each harboring secrets, each capable of both kindness and cruelty. The threads of motive intertwined in ways that only a patient observer could discern. She resolved to test the waters further, to engage the key players in conversation that might draw out hidden truths. There was a game to be played now, a delicate dance of words and glances, where a single misplaced remark could unravel the carefully constructed facades. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities, and Miss Marple intended to meet them with the quiet certainty that had guided her through many such mysteries. For in Luffington Bales, beneath the gentle surface of village life, the fire that didn't burn hot enough was still smouldering, and soon it would flare into a blaze that could no longer be contained. The days that followed the barn fire were heavy with tension, the villagers moving like shadows in the overcast light of early autumn. Miss Marple's quiet presence became a steadying one, a beacon of calm in the undercurrent of suspicion that gripped Luffington Bales. She knew the time was near for the subtle maneuvering of her final test, a carefully crafted conversation designed to unravel the truths hidden beneath layers of pretense. One crisp morning she invited Evangeline Carroway for a stroll through the village gardens behind the vicarage. The air was tinged with the scent of damp earth and late-blooming roses, a delicate contrast to the heavy matters that pressed between them. "Mrs. Carroway," Miss Marple began gently, "you've carried a great deal with you. Not just the pain of loss, but the weight of silence. Sometimes, speaking even the smallest truth can begin to lighten such a burden." Evangeline glanced away, eyes misted with memory. "I wish it were so simple. The past has a way of clawing back, especially when others would prefer it remained buried." Miss Marple nodded knowingly. "And yet it is often those who seem most fearful of the past who have the most to hide." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Arthur Pendry, who approached with a tentative smile. "Miss Marple, Mrs. Carroway, I thought you might want to know that the police have found something near the old Chelsea site." A grim curiosity sparked in both women's eyes. Arthur handed them a small, weathered box. Inside, wrapped in oilskin, lay a bundle of charred letters, only partially destroyed by fire. The letters were addressed to Thalia Carroway, written in a familiar hand. Miss Marple's fingers trembled slightly as she carefully unfolded one. The ink was smudged, but legible enough to reveal threats veiled in polite language, warnings against prying too deeply into matters best left alone. "These letters," Evangeline whispered, "were thought lost in the fire years ago. Whoever preserved them must have had a purpose." Miss Marple's mind raced. The letters were a direct link to the dark history that had shadowed the Carroway family, and a tangible clue that someone was desperately trying to conceal. That evening, she invited Julian Hawkes for tea, knowing the historian's curiosity about the Carroways had deepened noticeably. As they sat by the fire, Miss Marple observed Hawkes carefully, noting the quickening of his breath and the subtle twitch of his fingers when she produced a copy of one of the letters. "Quite remarkable, isn't it?" she said softly. "These letters reveal more than just family quarrels. They hint at fear, and perhaps at guilt." Hawkes's face tightened for a moment before he recovered his composure. "History often holds uncomfortable truths. Sometimes it is better to let the Past rest. Miss Marple's gaze was steady. And yet history also teaches us that what is hidden can fester until it demands to be acknowledged. Their exchange was interrupted by a knock at the door. The constable entered quietly, carrying a visitor, Lionel Denham. Denham's presence brought a sudden, tangible charge to the room. His gaze swept over the letters, then rested on Hawkes with something unreadable in his eyes. "I hear you have uncovered things best left forgotten," Denham said, voice low. Miss Marple met his gaze calmly. "It is not for us to decide what the past deserves, Mr. Denham, but rather to seek the truth." The evening wore on with a tense conversation that left Miss Marple piecing together subtle reactions, half-spoken fears, and guarded admissions. She sensed the interplay of power and regret, each word a calculated step in a silent dance. Days later, news spread through the village that another attempt had been made to interfere with evidence. The charred letters had been disturbed in the vicarage library, though nothing was taken. It was a brazen act that sent a clear message. Miss Marple responded by gathering the key villagers at the village hall under the pretext of a meeting to discuss community safety. There, in the flickering candlelight, she spoke not of the crime, but of human nature, of how secrets, no matter how deeply buried, have a way of revealing themselves. Her words were simple but pointed, and she watched the faces around her closely. The careful masks slipped for a moment, revealing glimpses of guilt, fear, and defiance. Later that evening she met privately with Reverend Collins. "The village is restless," the vicar said, "and I fear someone's desperation may lead to further tragedy." Miss Marple agreed. "It is a fragile time, but the truth must emerge no matter the cost." Her final test took shape the next day. At a small gathering in the vicarage garden, she invited each of the primary suspects, Evangeline, Hawkes, Denham, and Arthur Pendry, to join her for tea. The setting was casual, but every word was measured, every glance deliberate. Miss Marple spoke with apparent innocence about the nature of fear and the weight of old secrets, weaving in subtle references to the fire, the letters, and the recent attempts to conceal the past. She observed as each person reacted. Evangeline's composure faltered only slightly, a flicker of sadness passing through her eyes. Hawkes shifted uneasily, his usual calm veneer cracking ever so slightly. Denham's jaw tightened, his hands clenched into fists. Arthur Pendry seemed the most relaxed, but avoided direct eye contact when the topic turned to the Carraway estate. The conversation reached a turning point when Miss Marple asked, "Who among us fears the fire that didn't burn hot enough? Whose silence feeds the smouldering ashes?" The room fell into a heavy silence. It was then that a subtle but telling gesture caught her attention, a barely perceptible glance exchanged between Denham and Hawkes. In that moment, the delicate web of deception began to unravel. Miss Marple knew the final pieces were falling into place. The truth was near, hidden in the interplay of loyalty, fear, and long-buried resentment. As the guests departed, each lost in their own thoughts, Miss Marple remained seated, her mind already moving toward the revelation that would soon bring the village's darkest secrets into the light. Luffington Bales, once serene and unassuming, stood on the cusp of truth, and the quiet detective from St. Mary Mead was ready to deliver the verdict that none would forget. The morning light filtered softly through the lace curtains of Miss Marple's sitting room, casting delicate patterns over the well-worn carpet. There was a quiet stillness in the house, a calm that belied the storm about to be unfurled in the heart of Luffington Bales. The village had become a crucible of secrets and suspicions, but Miss Marple's serene composure was unshaken. Today, she would gently but decisively untangle the threads that bound this mystery together. She began her day, as always, with a cup of tea and a careful review of the notes she had made over the past weeks. The charred letters, the guarded glances, the subtle reactions at the vicarage garden gathering. Each was a clue carefully placed on the grand chessboard she was now ready to unveil. Miss Marple's first call was to the local constable, a courteous young man named Inspector Havisham, who greeted her with a mixture of respect and relief. "Miss Marple, I'm glad to see you. The villagers are on edge. They want answers." "Answers will come, Inspector," she replied kindly. "But they must come fully formed, lest we mistake shadows for truths." Together, they made their way to the village hall, where the key figures, Evangeline Carroway, Lionel Denham, Julian Hawkes, and Arthur Pendry, had been summoned under the pretense of a meeting to discuss recent village events. The room was filled with an undercurrent of unease, eyes flickering with cautious anticipation as Miss Marple entered. She began with soft words, acknowledging the community's distress, then turned her gaze to each individual in turn, weaving a narrative that recounted the incidents with careful precision. She spoke not only of facts, but of human nature, the fears and failings that drive people to desperate measures. As she spoke of the fire at Chelsea, her voice took on a measured tone rich with quiet understanding. A fire, once thought an unfortunate accident, was in truth a desperate act. One born not of carelessness, but of fear. Fear that a secret would be revealed, a reputation tarnished, a family destroyed. Her eyes settled on Evangeline, who remained composed yet visibly affected. "Mrs. Carroway, you bore the weight of that secret, and for years carried its consequences alone." Evangeline's voice trembled as she replied, "I did what I thought was necessary, to protect those I loved." Miss Marple nodded gently, allowing the confession to settle before moving on. She turned to Julian Hawkes. "Mr. Hawkes, your arrival stirred questions you tried to answer with polite curiosity. Yet you too carry a burden, a past entwined with these events." Hawkes swallowed hard but met her gaze. "I came seeking truth, Miss Marple. Sometimes the past is a mirror one must face." Then her gaze shifted to Lionel Denham, whose expression was inscrutable. "Mr. Denham, you have fought to reshape your life here. Yet old fears and grudges linger like ghosts. You sought to protect yourself, but at what cost?" Denham's eyes flashed with a mixture of anger and regret. "I did what was necessary to survive." Finally, Miss Marple addressed Arthur Pendry. "And you, Mr. Pendry, have navigated these troubled waters with a quiet wisdom, yet even you have secrets that have influenced the course of events." Arthur inclined his head, acknowledging the truth without words. Miss Marple paused, letting the room's tension build gently, then produced the charred letters. These letters were nearly lost to fire, but fate preserved them for us. They reveal threats and warnings, and show that the past was far from buried. She read aloud passages, careful to convey the menace and the desperation behind the polite words. As she spoke, she watched the reactions closely. Evangeline's eyes filled with tears. Hawkes's fingers clenched the armrest of his chair. Denham's jaw tightened, and Arthur's gaze dropped to the floor. Then Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her voice lowering. The fire that did not burn hot enough was a signal, an attempt to silence. But silence cannot hide guilt forever. The room was thick with silence, broken only by the soft crackling of the fireplace. "Now," Miss Marple said, "we come to the heart of the matter, the true culprit among us." She paused, giving them all a moment to absorb her words before continuing. "The person who set the fire in Chelsea years ago and who sought to cover their tracks with threats and intimidation is none other than Lionel Denham." Gasps and startled glances filled the room. "Mr. Denham," she continued, "your past actions were driven by fear that your involvement in the Carroway tragedy would be exposed. You believed that by controlling the narrative, By silencing those who knew the truth, you could secure your place in Luffington Bales. Denham's composure cracked. You don't know what I've suffered. But I know enough, Miss Marple said softly. The pattern of your behaviour, the sudden arrival to the village, the veiled threats, the attempts to interfere with evidence, all point to your desperation. She turned to Hawkes. And you, Mr. Hawkes, were drawn here by a desire to uncover history's truth, unaware at first of the personal stakes. To Evangeline she said, your courage in holding on to the letters and speaking today has been invaluable. And finally, to Arthur Pendry, your quiet loyalty to the village, though complicated, has been a source of strength. Denham's shoulders sagged, defeat evident. Yes, it was me. I wanted to protect what little I had left. I never meant to hurt anyone. Miss Marple's eyes were kind but firm. The past can never be changed, but truth can bring peace, not just to us, but to those who suffered. Inspector Havisham stepped forward to place Denham under arrest, the villagers watching in stunned silence. As the crowd dispersed, Miss Marple remained by the fire, reflecting on the fragile balance between forgiveness and justice. The village of Luffington Bales had been shaken, but the smouldering embers of fear had finally been doused by the steady hand of truth. In the quiet that followed, Miss Marple thought of human nature, how easily fear and shame can lead to desperate acts, yet also how compassion and understanding can heal even the deepest wounds. The fire that didn't burn hot enough had left scars, but now, at last, it could rest, its secrets revealed and the village free to begin anew. The soft murmur of the village settling back into its usual rhythm filled the air as autumn deepened around Luffington Bales. The streets, once heavy with whispered suspicions and guarded glances, now held a cautious quietude, though beneath it lingered an unmistakable air of unease. The shadow cast by recent revelations had not yet fully lifted, but the truth, at last, had brought a measure of peace. Miss Marple sat in her favourite armchair by the fire, the gentle glow casting flickering light upon her thoughtful face. The village's tangled web of secrets had finally been unravelled, the delicate threads laid bare without fanfare, just as she had known they would be. It was her quiet genius, to see beyond appearances, to listen not just to words, but to the silences between them. The revelation that Lionel Denham had been the orchestrator behind the fire and the threats that followed had stunned many. But for those who knew the subtle ways of human nature, it had not come as a surprise. Denham's fear of exposure, his desperate attempts to control the narrative, had blinded him to the consequences of his actions, consequences that nearly destroyed a family and fractured the community. Yet it was not anger or condemnation that settled in Miss Marple's heart. Rather, it was a deep, abiding understanding of the frailty and complexity of human motives. Lionel had been a man trapped by his own history, haunted by choices made long ago and overwhelmed by the weight of secrets he believed necessary to keep. As the village began to heal, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the many faces she had encountered, the proud, the fearful, the regretful, and the hopeful. Each had played a part in this story, none entirely innocent, yet all deserving of compassion. Evangeline Carroway, whose resilience had quietly anchored the investigation, had begun to reclaim her life from the shadows of the past. Julian Hawkes, ever the seeker of truth, had found in Luffington Bales a deeper appreciation for the human stories behind the history he pursued. Arthur Pendry, steadfast and wise, remained a reassuring presence for the village, a reminder that amidst turmoil, steadfast kindness endured. Miss Marple herself, as ever, remained modest about her role. To the villagers, she was simply the kindly, elderly woman with a penchant for knitting and a sharp mind. But to those who understood, she was the gentle force that had restored order, not through force or spectacle, but through patience, empathy, and a keen eye for the truth hidden in human nature. As dusk settled, Miss Marple looked out of her window toward the fading light over the village. The fire that hadn't burned hot enough had left its scars, but the embers of hope were glowing quietly beneath. And as always, she knew that where there were people, there would be mysteries. Yet she was ready, for whatever the future might bring. The heart of Luffington Bales would beat on, steady and strong. With a contented sigh, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, the rhythmic clicking of needles a comforting counterpoint to the restored peace. In the end, it was the simplest things, the kindness, the quiet understanding, that outshone the darkest secrets. And so the village settled back into its gentle rhythms, its stories now told, its wounds beginning to heal, forever marked by the insight and compassion of one small woman whose sharp mind had seen what others could not.